file begins. January 2026. The final document cache from the Epstein estate is unsealed. It is not an explosion. It is a quiet, digital poison seeping into the public record. Buried in a subfolder of archived correspondence is a file named GHM_travel_NQ_2011. Inside, a single email thread. The sender address, emusk@tesla.com. The recipient, Ghislaine Maxwell. The question posed was not about physics or finance. It was an inquiry into the anatomy of hedonism. Heard stories? Planning a trip? Pause. What would it take to attend the wildest party you've ever thrown on the island? The words landed like a drop of acid on a photograph. The world's futurist, the man building tomorrow, was suddenly asking about the darkest corners of yesterday. The global reaction was a cold, silent shock. Disbelief was the first line of defense for millions. This had to be a mistake, a forgery. The equation of Musk and Epstein was a calculation the public mind refused to process. The name that promised starships was now tethered to an island that promised ruin. The response from Maxwell, if one existed, was not in this initial release. A calculated void, leaving only the question hanging in the digital ether, and the unspoken promise that whatever came next would be worse. The silence from the Austin bunker lasted 7 hours, an eternity in the digital age. Then, the verdict was delivered not in a courtroom, but on Platform X. It was not a press release. It was a concrete slab of a statement. This is a complete fabrication, a deepfake. I have never been to that island and never corresponded with these people. Short, brutal, devoid of emotion. The denial immediately fractured the narrative. For his legions of followers, it was proof of a conspiracy, a targeted strike by the enemies of progress. For everyone else, it was the hollow, predictable defense of a cornered man. The public image, forged in iron and memes, began to show hairline cracks. Tesla's stock ticker became a public cardiogram of trust. It fluttered. It dipped. The brand of the future was suddenly mired in the filth of the past. Digital forensics became the new priesthood. Experts were summoned to dissect metadata, to analyze email headers, to search for the ghost in the machine. Was it a state-sponsored smear, or was it simply the truth, exhumed from a digital coffin? The public debate was no longer about guilt or innocence. It was an inventory of sins, a referendum on the nature of reality itself, in an age where a man's legacy could be undone by a few lines of text. Pause. Authentic or not? Authentic or not? The question itself was a symptom of the disease. A world so saturated with his image that reality required verification. But the original code, the source of the man, was written long before the internet learned his name. It was compiled in the harsh sunlight of Pretoria, in a nation tearing itself apart. The ambition was not born of opportunity. It was an escape vector, a survival mechanism forged in social isolation and the pages of science fiction. His first ventures were not acts of creation. They were acts of brute force. Zip 2 was a blunt instrument designed to hammer the analog world of newspapers into a digital format. He and his brother slept in the office, showered at the YMCA, a classic Silicon Valley fable, but stripped of romance. This wasn't about changing the world. It was about proving the world wrong. Then came X.com, a hostile takeover of the very concept of money. His colleagues saw a brilliant, impossible-to-work-with founder. They saw a man who would rewrite code through the night, convinced his was the only way. This wasn't collaboration. It was a monarchy of one. The coup that ejected him while he was on his honeymoon was not a betrayal. Pause. It was a predictable outcome. A system rejecting a foreign body. He left with the money. But more importantly, he left with a core lesson etched in acid. Never again would he allow his legacy to be subject to a vote. The PayPal fortune wasn't a prize, it was ammunition. A war chest for a battle against enemies far more abstract. Physics, extinction, and the crushing gravity of mediocrity. He funneled the capital into two absurdities. One, a company to build electric cars when gasoline was still king. The other, a company to build private rockets when only superpowers dared to touch the void. This was not business. It was a public audit of his own sanity. SpaceX was born from contempt. Contempt for the bloated, risk-averse aerospace industry. The first 3 launches were not failures. They were multi-million-dollar explosions, a public spectacle of burning cash. The debris of the Falcon 1 rockets falling into the Pacific was the debris of his empire before it was even built. The press wrote his obituary. Investors fled. He was down to his last few million. One final attempt. Tesla was no better. A production hell, bleeding cash, hounded by short sellers who smelled blood. The factory floor was a meat grinder of dreams, churning through executives and engineers. His reputation was staked on 2 ventures simultaneously on the brink of death. The 4th Falcon 1 launch was the verdict. It clawed its way to orbit. A tiny victory against the infinite. Pause. And in that moment, the narrative was rewritten. The reckless gambler became the visionary. The madman became a prophet. The path to ruin had suddenly, terrifyingly, become the path to apotheosis. But apotheosis has a price. A toll paid not in coin, but in proximity to the abyss. As Musk ascended, so too did he enter an orbit populated by different kinds of monsters. Creatures who hunt not for capital, but for leverage. This brings us to the anatomy of a very specific kind of trap. Pause. The Epstein architecture. It was not a network of friends. It was a meticulously curated portfolio of compromised souls, a human ledger bound in expensive leather. The modus operandi was a masterclass in psychological corrosion. It began not with sordid propositions, but with intellectual flattery. He built a salon for the titans of science and finance, a self-styled symposium for the future. He didn't just procure bodies. He harvested minds, making men of genius feel understood. The hook was conversation. The bait was access to a world without rules, a playground for the intellect. Then came the second stage, the normalization of the taboo. A slow, patient introduction to a world where appetites were not judged. The final stage was the quiet click of the lock. A photograph, a flight log, a shared moment of indiscretion, now cataloged and stored, a digital ghost in the machine waiting. It was a system designed to ensnare not the weak, but the ambitious. The very men like Musk who believed they were too smart, too powerful, too focused on the stars to get caught in a web spun on the ground. At the geographic and spiritual center of this empire of compromise was an island, a private kingdom built on Caribbean limestone and buried secrets. Pause. Little St. James. It was less a home and more a purpose-built stage for the final act of degradation. The flight logs became a bitter testament, a roster of the powerful and the curious drawn to the flame. They called the events gatherings, a clinical misnomer. These were audits of character, performed in paradise. Each conversation was a deposition, each smile a calculation. The island itself was the primary witness, its strange blue and white striped temple, a monument to a hollow god. Its sundial, tracking hours that would never be fully accounted for. Visitors were allegedly stripped of their phones upon arrival, a security measure framed as a courtesy, a way to disconnect. In reality, it was the establishment of total control, an information blackout. Inside this bubble, a different physics applied. The gravity of consequence was suspended. This was the promise. A place where a man of influence could shed the weight of his own reputation. The terrible truth was that the island never forgot. It was a digital tomb, meticulously recording the sins of its guests, creating the ultimate form of collateral. The question was never who visited. The question was what piece of them they left behind. The question was not merely what they left behind, but how it would be found. The island's digital tomb was eventually cracked open not by a cataclysm, but by the slow grinding pressure of the law. A civil suit, then another. The legal process became a form of forensic archaeology. Lawyers, not adventurers, sifted through the digital sediment of a buried decade. Pause. They were looking for ghosts in the machine. And they found them. Thousands of them. Flight logs, calendars, emails. Each one a breadcrumb leading back to the same dark clearing in the woods. The unsealing of documents was not a single event. It was a slow, methodical dismemberment of a conspiracy of silence. Each new release was another shovelful of dirt thrown from a mass grave. The digital communications were the star witness, terse, coded, and utterly damning. They were the inventory of a vast human trafficking operation, conducted with the banal efficiency of a logistics company. The anatomy of the fall was written in kilobytes. And the world was about to learn that the network was far larger than anyone had dared to imagine. And in that digital deluge, a familiar name surfaced, Elon Musk. A single email unearthed from the server of Ghislaine Maxwell. It was not a confession. It was not an itinerary. It was on its face a simple inquiry. But in the context of the archive of sin, it was a permanent stain. The email's text was almost irrelevant. The to and from fields were the entire story. A direct connection, a digital handshake with the abyss. His denials were swift and absolute. Never met Epstein. Only knew Maxwell in passing. But the evidence was not about physical presence. It was about orbit. He was building rockets to escape Earth's gravity, yet he could not escape the gravitational pull of a single damning association. Suddenly, the ambition to colonize Mars seemed less like a grand vision and more like a desperate attempt to flee, to build a new world where the records of the old one could not follow. This email became a ghost in his own machine, a fatal line of code in the otherwise pristine software of his public persona. The man who promised a future of clean energy and interplanetary travel now had his name permanently logged in the ledger of earthly corruption. Pause. The verdict was already in, not in a court of law, but in the cold, permanent archive of public record. This archive is impartial. It does not care about mission statements or stock valuations. It is a great and terrible equalizer. The revelation was not merely a stain on one man's file. It was a seismic event that sent tremors through the entire ecosystem of the untouchables. The carefully constructed fortresses of public relations, built with billions and staffed by armies of spin doctors, were revealed to be made of glass. One errant message, one old photograph, one name on a flight log. That is all it takes now to bring the digital guillotine down. The public's hunger for accountability became a new market force, more volatile and dangerous than any stock index. It demonstrated that a reputation, once forged in steel, is now etched on a silicon wafer. Pause. Infinitely reproducible and shatterable. And so we arrive at the posthumous audit of a living man. The final entry in the ledger is not a number, but a question mark stained with ink. His trajectory is a paradox. A man who dreams in orbital mechanics, but stumbles over terrestrial ethics. The builder of futures who kept company with the ghosts of a sordid past. The core question of his legacy has been irrevocably altered. It is no longer, can he take us to Mars? It is now, what baggage will we take with us? The ambition to escape Earth's gravity now seems like a flight from moral gravity. This is his bitter testament. You can build a rocket powerful enough to leave the world behind, but you cannot outrun the shadow it casts on the launch pad. The verdict is not about guilt or innocence. It is about the cold, immutable fact that even in the sterile vacuum of space, the whispers from Earth will echo inside the helmet. Pause forever.